beside me, a light to the kerosene, and the places aren't real anymore, and the faces don't say anything, in the silent light of the mind-blown sphere. It's a game, Devil's Chess Club. Devil's Chess Club.
Welcome to Devil's Chess Club. I'm Aaron Good. To get early access to episodes of Devil's Chess Club, subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon. This episode is available to everyone courtesy of the new documentary film series, Four Died Trying, which premiered on November 22nd on Apple TV and other streaming services. You can now buy the Four Died Trying prologue on Amazon as well. Four Died Trying explores the extraordinary lives and calamitous deaths of President John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy. The next chapter should be available around New Year's Day, I am told. Today, Bryce and I are joined by Patrick Lawrence. A commentator, author, essayist, and lecturer, Patrick Lawrence has served as a correspondent and subsequently a columnist overseas for more than 20 years, chiefly for the International Herald Tribune and the New Yorker. He has won 2 Overseas Press Club awards, as well as other honors and prizes. His work has appeared in a wide variety of publications, including The Nation, The New York Times, Business Week, Time, Salon, and CounterPunch. Lawrence currently writes at the Floutist on Substack, and these columns are often carried by Consortium News and ScheerPost. Patrick Lawrence is the author of several books, including Time No Longer and his latest book, Journalists and Their Shadows, which I discussed with Patrick in a recent American Exception podcast episode. So check the show notes for links to his Substack and to his book. Patrick Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, a pleasure, as always, Aaron. And good to meet you, Bryce. Wonderful.
Good to meet you as well.
Now, you were able to fill in for us on short notice because Scott Ritter postponed, and I had already been stewing in my mind, although you didn't know this, but I'd wanted to ask you back to have a discussion about current events and also Empire and Chalmers Johnson's take on it, because he seems prophetic in some ways, and it's a fascinating subject. So I'm so thankful that you were able to fill in here on short notice. And I want you to know that this will be publicly available on the Four Died Trying website. And I want to ask you a little bit about the subject of the documentary series here as we start. This film series, in part the director, like, I'm in a strange position to do publicity for anything, it's not my natural inclination. But on this film project, John Kirby has said, these are state crimes against democracy, and a film has never put these together. Now, state crimes against democracy, he's referring to the work of Lance DeHaven Smith, who was my mentor and my dear friend. He was a kind of intellectual father figure to me, really, and he just died recently. And so I feel really fortunate to be at all connected to this project, because it's just, these things shouldn't be looked at separately. Oh, one guy died and then another guy, and isn't that strange? This, in retrospect, we see this is really part of the empire, and the way that it, they basically won't accept defeat. If they're going to lose through democracy, then they'll just kill people. As you've lived through some of these events, and as time has gone by, and what do you think of the 60s and those assassinations and their connection to the current terrible state of the U.S. empire? What are your thoughts on this as someone who's steeped in this history?
The first thing I think is we don't think enough about it, right? We think about the 60s and the counterculture and all that kind of thing, the anti-war movement, that's fine. But we don't really think about the 60s as quite a pivotal moment in American history. Maybe I should go back a little bit. We had another pivotal moment in the late 40s, in the 40s when Henry Wallace was going to be nominated to succeed FDR, and the Democratic machine tipped him out of bed and put Truman in. I assume your readers know a little bit about what Henry Wallace stood for. What did he call it? The century of the common man, instead of the American century, Henry Luce's dreadful thought. And so that was kind of a turning point. But let's go forward now. I think the Kennedys are a complicated pair of brothers. As I wrote in a recent column, what did I call it? What died in 1963? They came to office with a certain set of somewhat orthodox ideas. They were cold warriors and so on. But the scholars might think I'm oversimplifying or may even disagree. But so far as I know, they can discern they evolved very critically in the course of Kennedy's 3 years, and came to represent a real promise for this country to make a turn such as the one that Americans missed when Wallace was shoved to the side, right? That's why I mentioned Wallace earlier, right? Toward what? Toward a new way of presenting ourselves to the world, toward a notion of shared interests, and a constructive country and not a destructive country, not leading with the military, etc. And on the domestic side, I think we may have been headed for some peculiarly American form of social democracy, if such a thing is conceivable. But in any event, an authentic turn in a new direction. And we lost that. We lost it. We lost it 60 years ago. And we've been hurtling more or less in the opposite direction ever since. That's how I read the 60s. All four of those men evolved in the course of their careers as public figures. The two Kennedys, King, Malcolm X, and they all were poised, if not already beginning, to make a great deal of difference in the kind of country America was, in the way we treat ourselves and the way we conduct ourselves abroad. And to me, that's the tragic loss. It's the greatest loss in my lifetime, by way of lost potential, lost opportunity, that kind of thing. These are my thoughts.
Right. I mean, I didn't live through them, but having spent a good bit of time studying them and looking at how remarkably different these men and their ideas were from the leaders and the ideas that circulate today, it's just really sobering to look at them and what they were trying to do, and in the way that this dark force just exercised a veto power. In a sense, it's really the essence of fascism, but we're unable to look at it. That to me is this. It gets into what we're talking about today, which is the way of the power, and some of the themes of some of your recent articles. The way that power can just render us incapable of articulating what is being done to us and what is happening.
Yeah. I mean, when I published that column, you get comment threads. Some of my commenters said, actually, what we lost at that moment was our political process. Well, fair comment. If not the essence of our democracy. I count November 22, 63 a straight out coup, right? And obviously not bloodless, you know.
And one of the stranger accidents of this is that of the people that were around at the time, one of the only people to say this is a whole new form of government and it's going to be horrible and I'm not going to be alive to see it. That was what Jack Ruby said at one point when he was being questioned by
Really?
Earl Warren. He's being questioned by Earl Warren, and he's asking to be taken to Washington D.C. because he says his life is in danger, and he says that at the time. And who knows if
You
he
know,
was
Aaron.
The Ruby case is very strange, full of weird things like that.
Yeah, I learned from your book, Aaron, that if you didn't say it, you certainly prompted the thought in my mind. That was the moment when the national security state declared that it was in charge. You know, maybe Bryce agrees with that, right?
No, I fully do. Part of being on the American left is learning about, the various histories of military interventions and coups and, CIA overthrows and things like that. But, it doesn't really get tossed into to that bowl is the coup that happened in America. We don't talk about how the national security state brought a lot of the tactics and mindsets that it uses abroad here at home. I know someone like Douglas Valentine talks a lot about how the Phoenix program was an example of one of those external projects that was then brought home and put on the domestic level. And that seems to be what happened with this, with the assassinations.
Yeah.
That's what Malcolm X said. I mean, that's exactly what he said. That's what got him kicked out of, or not, it got him a punishment from Elijah Muhammad, peace be on him. But he said the chickens were coming home to roost. It was so succinct.
The funny thing about living through them, I was 13 when JFK was killed, 18 when King, and 15 when Malcolm was killed, 18 when King and Bobby were killed. At the time, people were not encouraged, and I don't think many people really did, put them together as a sequential set of events. There was not any I mean, at that time, the working understanding was still quite unshakable. America is a great country. Bad things don't happen here. These are a strange set of anomalies, in no way defining who we were, right?
The only time I had heard that these assassinations, like before I had the proper education of, the deeper side of history, but the only time I had heard that these assassinations were linked in any way was strangely in a conversation about gun control and how people saw that these assassinations kept happening and that guns were the central cause. And so that maybe that's a good case to try and get guns off the street. That was the only time I had heard them linked together in any way. It's pretty bizarre. In other countries, you can talk about the darker sides of their history. You can talk about how, General What's-His-Face overthrew President What's-His-Face. You can talk about how, there was a coup, but, there was a counter coup and we got over it. You can't have that history here because it threatens the integrity of the whole system if we say that it happened. If we say that there was an illegitimate transfer of power that was subsequently legitimized by time, if nothing else, well, that undermines the entire myth that the current political order is based on. And so we can't talk about it.
Yeah.
They did similar things if you look at the New York Times, I think it was in the 90s, they wrote an article about the exhumation of Zachary Taylor. And Michael Parenti has a good chapter on this. The exhumation and the details around it, the forensic details, do not eliminate the cause, the possibility of arsenic poisoning. In fact, they kind of point to it. But even then, the New York Times, when they wrote about it, and this group that was there to study this, they wanted to basically misrepresent the situation in order to somehow maintain that Zachary Taylor died of natural causes of gastroenteritis that just came on for no reason. I mean, so this is like they'll go back 100 years. And in this case, they're basically defending like the Confederacy or what became the Confederacy, you know, because the accusation is that it was the slave power that did this because they wanted the Compromise of 1850 to pass, which the vice president supported and the president didn't. So, but even then, the times when like they're invested in making the argument that that just can't happen in America. And we'll distort the facts to make it fit that, you know, that prime directive.
They're masters of obfuscation over there on 8th Avenue.
Yes, and I want to talk now about some of your more recent articles because people should follow your work at the Substack, the Floutist now, and this one is called Fugitive Virtue. I want to read a passage from it because this issue of just being able to dictate reality from on high, this is really the heart of many of our problems. The creep of censorship against independent, non-corporate media has been evident in the U.S. since the days of the Russiagate hoax, 2016 to 2020. But the IDF's genocide operation in Gaza has intensified the liberal authoritarians' attacks on dissident reporting, commentary, and free speech altogether. There are two reasons for this. One, the Israelis' racist savagery is so openly and obviously offensive to the most basic human values that it requires maximum effort to stifle objections to it. Two, the charge of anti-Semitism, dangerous, life-threatening anti-Semitism, makes excellent cover for those who think free speech is an antiquarian notion we must now dispense with. So I think these are important points. How do you see this playing out, where censorship is so antithetical to what we pretend to stand for, and what's being done in Israel and in Palestine is so brazenly criminal and murderous that they can't really hide it? I mean, where do you see this going?
Well, you know, I'm not the first to use the figure of speech. The power cliques in this country have no reverse gear, right? That becomes a problem time and time again. They can't get out of Ukraine. They've made a complete mess in Ukraine. There's no way they're going to win that one, but they can't get out of it, right? And in this case, in the Gaza case, let's start a little earlier. Russiagate was just a monumental farce, right? Everyone was screaming about conspiracy theorists, but the people screaming loudest were running the mother of all conspiracy theories, right? It became completely ridiculous. And I kept wondering at the time, how are these people going to get out of this radical overinvestment? And they did it the way I kind of suspected they would. They slithered out the side door quietly, right? In the case of, in the way more important case of Israel and Gaza, it looks to me like the cliques in Washington thought, and not without cause, in their experience, they can sell Americans pretty much anything. They thought they could sell this barbarity to Americans, and it would go down, perhaps with some difficulty, but they would get it done. Well, they're not getting it done, and the monstrousness of the whole thing has left them very overexposed. We three and all your viewers probably, know the statistics about how many people buy into this stuff and how many object, right? They're trying to control the universities now. The media, they don't even have to make an effort to control, right? So they've overinvested again, and it's just this time it's just too awful to sell. So what are they going to do? They're going to escalate, and I think that's where it's going for the time being. I think it's probably going to remain as bad as it is. Censorship and wild accusations of anti-Semitism. You know, if a Jewish person stubs his toe, it's an anti-Semitic incident at this point, right? I think there are signs of serious concern here. I was just discussing last night. Why are they going after the universities? Well, my wife suggested the statistics about 18 to 25-year-olds and 25 to 34s. Their sympathies with the Palestinians are over half, right, as measured by various polls. So what we have here is a generational shift, subtle, you know, not overnight, but slowly, you know, the memories of the Holocaust and everything that's been drilled into us, these things are not to be forgotten. But the reality of the Palestinian predicament is way more real to younger people than it is to older people. And so I think there's a lot of worry. How's that going to be countered? The censorship machine is very powerful. The only defense we have is our occasions like this, or one of the important defenses against this, are independent media. We have to keep on keeping on, you know. But it's a war at this point. It's a real war. The monopoly that corporate media enjoyed for how long do we want to go back in history? New technologies are breaking up that monopoly, making a great diversity of thought possible and available to people, and so there's a fight, right? And we have to keep ourselves going, you know. But I don't have a rosy picture to convey at this point. I wonder what you two think.
No, I totally agree. I mean, like I said, I'm here at a university right now. I'm a graduate student, and I'm working with the school's Palestine Solidarity Group, which I helped found when I was an undergrad to try and fight against that that overwhelming hegemonic pro-Israel narrative that most people grow up with, and that never really challenged in a serious way, even for educated people. But even now, we're seeing like some pushback against us. I mean, just recently, we learned that our faculty advisor is being suspended from teaching and suspended from advising any student organizations. And the ostensible reason for this was that he filled out a form wrong for our group to have an event. And they're saying that this event got canceled by the university, but the organization went forward with the event, and they're saying that he didn't advise us properly, and so they're suspending him. And this event was obviously a pro-Palestine event. We had Miko Peled at the school, but we just learned recently that he's being suspended. So they're coming after people in serious ways. It's not as bad as Rutgers or Columbia, where they banned the Students for Justice in Palestine. But that's only a matter of time. I mean, several different universities around the country have flat out banned Palestine solidarity groups. You've written about the ridiculous witch hunt, like Inquisition, that university presidents were subjected to in Congress. And it's not really about the facts of the case. It's not really about what they're actually saying. It's about sending a message to people that you can, even if you're reasonable, even if you have God and the facts on your side, we can put you through this ringer and make your life a living hell just to raise the cost of doing that. And that's what we call free speech in this country.
Yeah, really well reasoned.
Yeah, this is. The only thing that I would say is more of a cause for optimism is, as Patrick points out, the younger generation is not buying this, and this has to be very alarming, because they're losing that support. And in the UN General Assembly, Jeffrey Sachs, I've heard him speak about this very lucidly in recent weeks, and he pointed out that on the U.S. side, against any sort of ceasefire, there was essentially 1% of the global population was on the U.S. side. Like the vast majority of humanity is opposed to this slaughter. Most Americans want a ceasefire. The idea that by slaughtering these people and carpet bombing whole neighborhoods like this and killing so many children, leaving babies to die of exposure and dehydration, premature babies in incubators like this is horrific. It is horrific. And it's a shock to the whole world. And the idea that you have to accept this level of brutality because if you're not, you're somehow not protecting the human rights of Jews who are facing extermination or something from Hamas, which is so absurd to suggest that Hamas has the ability to do what they're claiming they have the ability to do. I mean, I feel that things are on the side. I think part of the reason that you see this aggressive, psychotic response from Israel is that they actually sense that Netanyahu himself as a leader, but also the eliminationist Zionist project, because of the decline of U.S. hegemony so dramatically, we see this in Ukraine, but elsewhere as well. They feel that they perhaps don't have as much time and that they needed to liquidate this area or what. But what are they? Even if they do this, U.S. hegemony is declining such that what are they going to be really presiding over in that area? I mean, I think that as Patrick said, and this is what C. Wright Mills said too about these crackpot realists, that they just accept the dominant framework and they're just obsessed with the next frenzied step and the next frenzied step, and they don't have the ability to course correct. And it's what's amazing and shows how powerful the U.S. was at the end of World War II is that it's taken this long for this project to come as close to unraveling as it has.
Yeah,
I think. I mean, it's something.
Yeah.
Now I want to talk about another one of your articles here, because it's something people should check out. So, the forced march into immorality. The subtitle here: Our humanity is now on the line, and you write that we must recognize these daily events as part of a concerted, coordinated effort to protect Israel from judgment by the most basic standards of human conduct, to redeem the irredeemable. This is to say, these whole of society campaigns effectively require citizens of the Western democracies, and we must not miss this, to surrender their morality, their decency, their consciousness of what it means to be human in the service of a barbarism with few equivalents in modern history. We are force marched, to put this point another way, into a state of either amorality or immorality, and at this moment I am not sure which is the intent. As Israelis behave barbarically, so are we required to become barbarians. To coerce people into such a state, to outlaw independent thinking in favor of a degrading orthodoxy, does this suggest Western societies now turn toward a new variant of totalitarianism? I'm not one to use language irresponsibly, but with bitterness I will pose the question. So to what extent are we living in a totalitarian system? And then our inability to understand it is actually just a part of that totalitarianism.
I don't think we're there yet. As I said in that piece, words like totalitarianism, fascism, these these sort of terms have very specific meanings, right? And I think we should observe those meanings. Inflating language doesn't strengthen one's case, in my view, right? I'm very happy to discuss the rise of liberal authoritarianism in America, and I don't think that's an inflated term at all, right? But to return to your question, or to get there for the first time, if you look at what this crisis, the Israel-Gaza crisis, has done to the American polity, it's just shocking, right? It's eating into our most basic institutions, our judicial system, our courts, our legislature are being corrupted with all this business. That the House of Representatives is now casting itself as qualified to give dictionary definitions of etc. You get the point, Zionism and all that, right? Preposterous, right? The courts are weighing in. I count universities. I know universities, and you're in one, Bryce, and you're a, what do I call you? Are a veteran or
Political
a
scientist.
survivor?
I mean,
A veteran or a survivor, right?
yeah.
Anyway, one or the other.
Recovering academic, I think, is the term.
Recovering it. Right. Setting aside the corporatization of higher education in this country, which is just an abominable phenomenon, right? But setting that aside for a minute, universities are, in my view, among the most basic sources of any society's dynamism and understanding of itself, a source of vision, a capability of looking forward, right? And we're destroying, the Israel thing is destroying the integrity of our universities. These are just cases of the extent to which this thing is ruining us, right? And I think the basic rub here for us, for Americans individually, okay, apart from institutionally, is the imperative the implicit imperative we should all pay attention to what's being attempted, the implicit imperative that we must abandon our morality, our decency, our personal standards. It's not okay to kill other people. Well, suddenly we're invited to say, oh, yes, it is. Right? I think this is really very grave. And Chaz Freeman used a phrase recently. He did a long segment for something called Open Source Radio. It was excellent. That this is the hinge of history, right? And I wrote about that. I couldn't agree more. I think this is a real turning point for us institutionally. Individually, we are called upon to accept that our fundamental humanity and decency we are going to be deprived of them, or we have to make our voices heard, and act. That's our moment, and it's, to me, quite large. I mean, it's always difficult for human beings to understand their moment, the present moment, as a passage in history. We can't see ourselves as historical actors very easily. It doesn't come naturally. We have to make a real effort, right? We can look at the past and say, this is what happened in the Civil War and this is how people were. But to understand our own moment as a passage in history is hard, but it's not impossible. And I think we are in a very large passage in the human story and in the American story. That's where I come out on this. Totalitarian, we're in that direction. I can't deny that, but I don't think we're there yet. I'm going by Hannah Arendt and others.
Right. I've thought that is. I'll quibble a little bit with the definitional issues here. I felt that totalitarianism, and then Sheldon Wollin's take on how the U.S. was becoming an inverted kind of totalitarianism. Like
good book.
A situation where it's top down, but it's arrived at that by demobilizing the population by and large, which I think is relevant. And I think in the bigger sense that a regime or a system is totalitarian and this is more or less what Hannah Arendt said, if there's no element of civil society that can challenge like top-down rule, more or less. And I think that a lot of what we do does conform to that. I mean, when you look at this, like looking at what is happening in Israel, the universities, the media, nobody is able to move the regime at all. I mean, to me, the iconic encapsulation of the U.S. policy is that one, a pathetic UN representative who at the UN Security Council raises, his corrupt little hand to veto a ceasefire so that they can go on slaughtering, women and children in Gaza. That is so top down. I mean, you see, like, who can persuade the head of state, who can speak to the emperor.
Aaron, understood entirely. But if again, I think we're in that direction. There's no question in my mind about it. But we mustn't, if we use that term to describe ourselves prematurely or as a matter of overstatement, we deprive ourselves of those features of our society that remain available to us.
Right.
They aren't many, and they're all under attack. But we three are talking now,
and not impacting. I mean, I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you that we must do this. What I think is going to bring this system down, and the extent that it is, this disguised version of top-down rule, is that events are going to overtake them. I don't think that, and this is where we're all, those of us who are paying attention are aghast in a way, in that it's horrifying, but it's also kind of exciting because I don't see that there's a better chance for a dramatic historical power shift than has been the case up to this point. And that is, and at that point, what will the despotism look like, or what recourse will the despots have? Because the rest of the world is now changed.
Do we have a lesson to learn from the Soviet Union when nothing ever changed and nothing was ever going to change, and bang?
What should we take from this? Or the British case? People say that the British walked away from their empire, and I don't think they really did that. But this actually brings me to the other subject that
May I answer your question just very briefly?
Sure.
Sorry to interrupt. What do we take from that? There's no such thing as stasis in social or political terms. There's always motion.
Yes.
It's which direction is the motion, and at what velocity, and so forth.
And I think that lends itself to the analysis that is sort of empowering, that we do have, even if we can't affect the decisions at the top at this moment, we can always work towards building institutions and organizations that can put pressure on any sort of governing structure, to the point where whenever there are shocks, like if there is a Soviet Union moment in America, if we do have a Gorbachev come out and call the whole thing off, well, then there'll be something from the bottom that is able to shape the outcome of what comes next. In the Soviet Union, they didn't have much. It was tossed to the oligarchs. The oligarchs, destroyed the economy, and they had to rebuild from the ground up. It was a worse shock than the famine under Stalin. But if we are able to now utilize the opportunities that we have to build what we can when we can, then when the next shock comes, we'll be in at least a better position to defend ourselves and to maybe build something a little bit better than before.
This is the work of our time, right? We're not going to clear the top of the mountain, but we have our quiet work to do, building a foundation for what we would like to see come, Anyway, we interrupted you, Aaron. How rude of us.
I know this is all very relevant because I want to talk about he was your friend, and I knew him only as a writer and a scholar, Chalmers Johnson, and he was writing right before the 9/11 wars started, but he was very prescient, and he wrote this trilogy of books beginning, I think that Blowback came out in 1999, Blowback, The Costs and Consequences of American
Yeah.
Empire, and then around 2003 or 4, The Sorrows of Empire, Militarism, Secrecy, and the End of the Republic was published, and I believe that Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic, was published in 2006. And I do feel that Nemesis is is as relevant as any metaphor that we could employ right now. I mean, what does Nemesis look like? I think that probably Brzezinski was prophetic in the Grand Chessboard when he said the nightmare scenario would be a Russia, China, Iran counter hegemonic bloc that would be united by grievances against the United States.
He called it the
Seems to have
barbarians
happened.
coming together.
The barbarians,
Did he?
the barbarians are coming together, and Israel is barbarously trying to, kill its way to safety. The U.S. is backing them. The U.S. went right up to the gate of the barbarians in Ukraine, as they, barbarians in quotation marks, and all they did was get the Ukrainians slaughtered on a massive scale. What do you think Chalmers Johnson would say if he were watching the events of the last few years, Patrick?
Well, Chal, he was a very multi-dimensional man. I think the important thing he did with the trilogy, which actually didn't start as a trilogy, it just looked like one, and then they called it one, right? Was to put the topic of empire in front of us, such that it could not any longer be either denied or dismissed as frivolous or fringy, right? He made it possible to talk about empire in frank, honest, to the point terms, no cotton wool language, as I call it, right? Let's just call it as it was. I sometimes argue in columns, nomenclature is very important. If you want to understand something, name it properly first, and then you're on the way to understanding it. And Chal made it possible in many ways to talk in honest terms about who we are and what we are doing in the world and what we should call it, right? I think, was it Caitlin Johnstone, somebody like that, remarked not long ago, it is quite extraordinary that America can run an empire and most Americans can't even see it. That's a pretty big lump under the blanket, I would say, right? Why? Because it's not named properly, right? And Chal made that possible. I think he opened a lot of doors and a lot of minds. And to me, that's the importance of those three books. And it certainly counts a lot that they were written by a scholar with proven gravitas, a long record of responsible scholarship. That certainly counted,
Right. I mean, his work on the Ministry of International Trade
Meaty,
and Industry,
yeah.
MIDI, was
Meaty.
legendary in comparative politics, and it was assigned, when I was a graduate student, which was, in the early 2000, starting in 2010. So he was really well established. But I took a security studies course, a graduate course, and the professor said, I mentioned something about Chalmers Johnson, and the professor said, yeah, he used to be a really respected scholar, but now he's a joke. And I would really like to talk to this guy now, because he was just a kind of a cookie cutter individual. I mean, not a bad guy, but just like the institution produces these guys, right? These security guys.
He was an automaton from what
And it would be really interesting to see if he has come around to realize that, like, actually the joke is on him. Well, the joke is him. I mean, none of these guys that make all of these arguments, anybody who's paying attention, they're revealed as, frauds and just kind of careerist clowns. I think by and
Yeah,
large, the
I
whole
was
the whole system in the
I
IR.
was thinking before we came on together, because you had mentioned in a note what topics we would cover. So I was reflecting on Chalmers' trajectory, right? And it occurred to me, I think maybe for the first time, that the Meaty book. Remember when the Meaty book came out, we had Ezra Vogel, Japan is number one. And we had Edwin Reischauer, who was the cheerleader in chief for the Japanese miracle and happy nation of industrious little worker ants and so on and so forth, right? That was what it was, sheer Orientalism, right? And that was the context of the Meaty book. And the Meaty book actually took apart, wait a minute, this is actually how Japan works. It's an extremely precise machine with the distinction between bureaucracy and corporate leadership practically invisible, right? The way the whole political economy worked, Chalmers tore that wide open. That's the significance of the book, if I'm not oversimplifying. And it occurred to me while I was thinking about our conversation before we started, it was kind of, if you have that in mind, the trilogy is not that surprising, right? He was by the time he stepped aside at University of California, well along in this kind of thinking. I remember I wrote a Japan book myself. It came out in '97, I think, a big one for me. And Chalmers and Sheila were extremely generous with their advice and so on. They read each chapter as I produced it. And at one point I said, Chal, when do you get to say what you want? And without hesitation, he said, when you're 65, right? I thought it was very funny. And I think when he stepped out of the academy and started writing the trilogy, and they were not the only things he wrote, right? He wrote quite a lot about Okinawa and a lot of periodical stuff, right? Harper's, American Prospect, what have you, right? I just think he kind of stepped out of the academic orthodoxy, and people still in it, dependent upon it. That's what you're going to get. I don't imagine I'm surprising you, Aaron, and maybe not you either, Bryce. That's what you're going to get from these people. You just have to accept it. I get the same thing from mainstream journalists still functioning in the mainstream, right? I've lost a lot of friends since I said goodbye to all that, right? It's not permissible. As LBJ said, you're either inside the tent urinating out or outside the tent urinating in, right? And it's not, if you step outside the tent, a lot of people just can't handle it. And I think that's what happened to Chow.
Right. I mean, he wrote very interesting things about Japan that were more in the realm of what I would write at the end of, near the end of his life. He wrote this great review in the London Review of Books of Sterling Seagrave's book Gold Warriors, and he also wrote a journal article that he co-wrote with Norbert Schley and someone else, but it was about the M Fund and all of that money. And really, what he was pointing out was really one of the unreported, unknown scandals lost to history, which was the U.S. seizure of looted Japanese gold and the way that money was used to set up slush funds, including funds which basically bankrolled the LDP, which has ruled Japan as a one-party state. And he's a he's the authority on Japan and the inner workings of the political economy of the
Yeah.
Japanese state, which, as you point out, when you understand that he dispassionately looked at the political economy of Japan and explained it when nobody else was able to put it together for whatever reason, it does make sense that that's what he would do with the U.S. case. And then he takes that knowledge and I think he applies it to the darker aspects of what has been happening to Japan, because Japan is essentially a CIA creation. I mean, the LDP was established with a huge slush fund set up by with stolen loot from Yoshio Kodama, who was a Yakuza gangster and a admiral in the Navy later. And he should have been executed, but the CIA springs him from jail, and he takes this huge slush fund and sets up the LDP. And the slush fund is like looted material from China and other countries in Asia. So that's a hit. The people of Japan don't know, and the Americans don't understand this history. We don't. It's like a great microcosm of just how corrupt the whole enterprise is. Like the whole Japanese state has been a one-party state, and that one party was created by a gangster who should have been hanged, but wasn't because the CIA intervened. It's astounding.
And it's something of a template for how America was going to run the world after the 1945 victories, right? Democracy, well, you point this out in your book, Aaron, democracy had very little to do with the project, right? The project was power. And in many ways, what we did in Japan is what we were going to do, variations on the theme all over the place, all over Asia, the Middle East, et cetera, right?
Right, and I did have some gripes with Chalmers Johnson, which I'll tell you, and you can tell me if you think these make sense or not. He was a very smart man and an iconoclast, which means he cannot but have something of an ego, which I think at some points comes across when he's kind of dismissive of certain critiques beyond a certain point. So but I say this with great admiration for the guy in general. I feel the way that he approaches China, that there's a little bit of a kind of Orientalism in his kind of disdain for what the Chinese communists were trying to do. I essentially feel like, given that history of China and what they went through with the Opium Wars and the Boxer Uprising and the huge penalties attached to that, and then Japan brutalizing them, killing maybe 20, maybe 30 million people. It's hard to even know. That is a situation that a Westerner, I don't feel you can really judge too much what the mistakes and other things that they did, because we just don't have the context to do that.
Yeah.
And so he on the one hand, he does predict that they're going to become a superpower that the U.S. will contend with. So he's prescient there, but I feel like he has a little bit of anti-communism that he can't quite see it himself at times.
I suppose vestiges, earlier in his career, and maybe even into mid-career, he was never agency, but he cooperated with the agency by way of.
He says I was a spear carrier for Empire. He writes that at
Yeah.
one point.
Yeah. And there's you get this in people of Chalmers' kind, a kind of, I want to be careful of the word, but something like a penitence, right? Regret. I had it wrong. I don't know whether I am remiss in suggesting another example, but there's I find a little bit of that in Ray McGovern, for example, a little bit of it in Oliver Stone, people came into adulthood with a certain set of ideas, and then crude expression, but the light bulb went on at a certain point, and probably not suddenly, but gradually, and they began to realize, whoa, I was wrong. We've been reading about Dorothy Thompson lately, one of the great journalists of the 20th century, right? Who was early in the 30s a very strong advocate of the Jewish cause, and indeed the Zionist cause. And then after the war, she went to Palestine to see what was going on there. And she witnessed the early terrorist attacks that Zionists were mounting against the British. And she witnessed the early brutality against the Palestinians, right? And she shifted very, very dramatically. And in 1950, wrote an article in Commentary, which was a very different sort of magazine at the time, very critical of Zionism. That extinguished her career, right? The Jewish lobby, such as it was then, came after her big time, and she had a very, very hard time publishing after that.
What year was the essay?
The piece was, I believe it was 1950, and I think you can find it online without a great deal of difficulty. We've been wondering about reproducing it at the Floutist. It's really remarkable. What I like about it is what's going on now. It has a long, long history, and it's useful to remind people of this history. This has been going on, the Jewish lobby, AIPAC, and all that. And it's been going on since. Israel has never existed without this kind of propaganda protection. Not for a day. It was there immediately, right? But we've been wondering about reproducing it. But my thought is that we would have to have permission from Commentary. And Commentary, when they published Dorothy Thompson, was, it was a Jewish magazine, but it was, it was intellectually engaged and open to different opinions. Commentary now is not that way. And I said to Kara last night, well, we can ask them, but my hunch is they would never let us reproduce that. That's the last damn thing they want out there right now.
Yeah, that would seem to be the antithesis.
But anyway, I recommend it to your viewers. Dorothy Thompson, 1950. I can't remember the headline. Something to do with Zionism.
Right, and so this is a person who had to confront serious orthodoxies like Chalmers Johnson was doing, and he details so many episodes or aspects of it that I think the significance of it is lost to me in a way because I'm so steeped in all of it that it's all stuff that I've kind of studied separately from his writing about it. But as an academic or basically a mainstream academic, he was laying this all out really systematically, and he did confront his old kind of conventional Cold War liberal point of view, and made a lot of
greatly to respect.
Yes, and made much progress. I think he doesn't. There are some issues where he seems to contradict himself. He talks about the imperial presidency, and then he talks about the Praetorian Guard and how they kind of became a thing of their own. And he never really reconciles those two ideas and those two critiques, because at times he says, oh, the CIA, he does what Schlesinger does, which is a strange thing, because Schlesinger himself, he wrote the imperial presidency. Okay, even as he also regretted at the end of his life, he said his big regret was that he never wrote this book about the CIA, and he always believed the CIA had killed his hero, President Kennedy, but because he was such an establishment fellow, he could never really come out and say it. It was always like, oh, maybe I don't know what happened, like just kind of a sad nerd in that way.
Yeah.
And Chalmers Johnson is not, from a totally different point of view, but on this issue of how do we look at the autonomy of these entities? and they're Wall Street benefactors. I think that is one thing that he really missed, was the fact that it was really Wall Street. It was the private sector that did this. I think the political scientist in him, and his Cold War background made him. That was the one place that he couldn't go with his. I mean, he did talk about corporate greed, but it was always as intertwined with the state, and with the implication that it was the government in the driver's seat, and then opportunist profiteers. Not that aspect is missing, I think, from his work.
I think I don't know how to name this, but I think there was a basic shift in Chow's sort of MO, right? During the early years, he wrote the book on the Chinese Revolution, and then he wrote Meaty and so forth. He was functioning as a scholar. When he wrote the trilogy, he was functioning as, what's my word? A commentator. He was kind of
polemicist.
And he wasn't purporting scholarly granularity or anything, right? So,
he was a sagacious kind. It was like a scholar sage sort of thing.
Yeah,
I think I understand what you're saying. It was very scholarly and very meticulous, but it wasn't done in the narrow confines of like what political science produces.
Yeah, I mean, he wasn't into footnotes.
What it produces sucks, so more is the better that he chose that route.
He wasn't going to write a footnoted text, right? It was more like he was advancing a perspective on America and America's place in the world, more than a scholarly investigation of those same topics. I think that's where the power of those books comes from. They're quite approachable.
Right. And I think something else, which I think was a blind spot for him, and I think it was a blind spot for me, is the extent to which post-Cold War foreign policy may have been driven more by Israel and the Zionist lobby and just Zionism as a force in general, than people wanted to acknowledge or wanted to accept. Because as I think back on it, so the U.S. And what I would think of as the U.S. deep state, the U.S. establishment, that oligarchic force that creates the conventional wisdom of the empire, that's typically like the sort of encapsulation of business interests and business logic and realist kind of economic logic. And the U.S. has not operated according to that logic. This is something that has to be explained, is why in realist terms has the U.S. embarked on such stupid things in the Cold War. And, I had Lawrence Wilkerson on here, and he was saying that he thinks that the reason Bush lost in 92 was that he stood up to Israel basically over the two-state solution for a moment.
Interesting.
And as I think about it, and how Bush could claim to have ended the Cold War with some credibility, I mean, it's much more complicated than that. And it looked that he had won the Gulf War in a triumphant way at the time, which is complicated, but set that aside. How did he lose as an incumbent? And then you look at the other things the U.S. was doing after 9/11, and like they are bad policies. Like it was foolish to invade Iraq. It was foolish to try to occupy Afghanistan. It was foolish to launch those Arab Spring wars. But and then you look at these other conflicts that have been around Somalia and Yemen in recent years, and then you think like, well, what is the influence of the U.S. support for Zionism related to that? It's like it does seem that it's overridden the cold calculus of U.S. imperialism, and that the policies have been stupid and actually disastrous from if you're an evil imperialist and you want to be as good an evil imperialist as you can, these were stupid policies. And maybe Israel has been more of an overriding element in this constellation of forces that's driven us to this point.
You prompt me to share a question that is very current in this wonderful household where we're staying at the moment. Does America control Israel? You can imagine we're talking about this. Can America stop the war? I'm asking both of you. Does America control Israel, or does Israel control America? And my answer to date is I'm not sure it makes a difference. It's It's how many Zionists can you fit on the head of a pin or something? I mean, it doesn't matter one way. The distinction is almost artificial, you know.
Yeah, like if we consider what the American, deep political system is, we can see it as a conglomeration of like interests, corporate interests, ideological interests, political interests, all that stuff. And it sits on top of a public electoral system, all that stuff. But those interests include some of the same people that run Israel's country, that run Israel's deep political system, that share interest there. I mean, sometimes they're sitting on the same boards of the same companies. Sometimes it goes so far as it's the same people, like the same actual individuals. And so, saying which one controls the other, I mean, just on a pure power analysis, America has more powerful than Israel. Israel cannot exist in the way that it is without the American.
Yeah, but Bryce, it's like a Zen koan. America is much more powerful, but who controls America?
Yeah, exactly, and
Yes.
that's what gets to the question of like who holds the most sway within that deep political system, within both deep political systems. And it seems that Israel and its interests have managed to gain a significant foothold within the American deep political system, just as a matter of course, just as a matter of who has the money, who has the influence, who has been there for a long time, who has the offices right next to the important people. And historically, that answer has been Israel and its lobby. And
Yeah, Alan McLeod, who does excellent work. I don't know him personally. He writes for something called Mint Press News.
he's a great guy. I know him.
We've had him on the show here before.
Oh, have you?
Yeah.
Well, you tell him I greatly admire his work. He's consistently excellent. He came out with a piece just the other day. Who are the political figures who have taken the most money from Israel since, I don't know what his time frame was. Biden was number one,
Yeah.
$4+ million, $4 million plus dollars, right? So
Yeah,
Yeah.
and like that's how you control the political. Like it's deeper than some other lobbies. Like you can compare it to like big tobacco, who can purchase scientists and manufacture fake science as propaganda, and they can
Yeah.
buy politicians to vote for the bills that they want. Israel has all that, but they also have this messianic hold on the Christian right, and they also have this hold on some sector of young Jewish community that goes beyond the hard nosed. It goes beyond just business, because we talk about Israel as being part of the American empire, but Israel and its position within the American empire also makes it more difficult to run the empire. It's
Yeah.
harder to run the Middle East. It's harder to run the puppet governments over there if you're also, with the other hand, supporting one of the most hated entities in that region.
Yeah.
It's hard
Wait,
to
one
do
of. Well, I mean, not one of.
that. Yeah, I guess the single most hated entity in the
challenge
region.
champion of being hated over in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's that part, that aspect of the power the fact that it has so much influence over individuals. When I have a friend who was in Bloomington, and he worked for a congressman there years ago, and he said that on his congressional staff, the days that the congressman would have to get visited and talked to by the representatives of the Israel lobby, that his boss, the congressman, was so demoralized and defeated looking that he would just have to sit there and say like, yes, sir, and so on. And that it was just understood that like, you have your power in America, you have many bosses if you're powerful. And that seemed to be the case there. And how does that play out in colleges where you have people persecuted if they criticize Israel? High schools, public high schools, private high schools, especially private high schools are terrified of this because of donors and everything else. And it gets into like, it happens so often that there's no pretending that it's not happening. So
Yeah.
how is it that there's so many donors across the the world that are so committed on this issue, it's a difficult thing to approach, because you're really saying, I mean, you're talking about a very wealthy and politically mobilized group of people that seem to be ready to bring their weight to bear on any institution where they just are playing whack-a-mole with any institution
Yeah.
that criticizes Israel's behavior.
I mean, I think the Gaza crisis has tipped the AIPAC phenomenon over into an open First Amendment question. It's now right out there for everyone to see, you know. And again, going back to the universities, we now have hedge fund managers and so on purporting to tell universities how to run themselves. What craziness is this? You know, this is what I meant earlier when I was discussing the destruction of our university system. Yeah, Wall Street people telling universities what they can do and not do. It's the beginning of the end, you know.
Right.
Mhm.
So, Patrick, I would like to give you a chance to tell people where they can find your book, and you can talk about your Substack as well. So, why don't you tell people where they can find the work you put out, which is, I recommend. You're a great writer, and people should read your work.
Well, very kind of you, Aaron. Aaron, I'll mention to your listeners, was very kind to offer an endorsement of the book that's now on the screen. That started as an essay for a quarterly journal and grew into a book. It's you can get it from the publisher directly, a really good bunch of people. It's called Clarity Press, and they're pretty good about shipping and all that. Or you can get it on Amazon. Those are the two places I know. It's just out this past autumn. I'm delighted that Aaron's given me a chance to mention it. And apart from that, you can find me at the Floutist. That's my Substack newsletter. I publish regularly at Consortium News and ScheerPost. Those are the two publications that give me space on a regular basis. So ScheerPost, Consortium News, the Floutist. I'm around, and thank you for the time here, Aaron. I won't take up more of it.
It's been our pleasure, and we will put links to those in the show notes. So, Patrick Lawrence, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your
Great
time.
pleasure. And Bryce, nice to meet you. Have a good Christmas, both of you.
Thank you. You too. You too.
Okay. Cheers.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please visit fourdiedtrying.com and buy the prologue, now on Amazon. Check the show notes for links to Patrick Lawrence's Substack and to his book, Journalists and Their Shadows. And please do subscribe to the American Exception podcast on Patreon for first access to all Devil's Chess Club episodes and for all new and past episodes of the American Exception podcast. I'm grateful to Patrick for appearing on such short notice here. It's fortifying to discuss these things with him, and I'm also happy that we could reflect on the seminal work of Chalmers Johnson. I do disagree with some aspects of Johnson's work, but on the whole, we can't diminish the fact that he was alone among established political scientists in looking at the political elephant in the world historic room. I'm talking about the U.S. empire, of course. Today, by and large, Chalmers Johnson's predictions are coming true. Nemesis has arrived. The empire will reign forever until it won't. Afghanistan, Ukraine, Palestine, Nord Stream, NATO, the EU, it's all falling apart. This was inevitable once the U.S. embarked on its global dominance quest. Somehow, humanity needs to stop playing the game. No one wins forever on the devil's chessboard, except Satan.